So welcome everyone. Our guest today is Dr. Erica Wise, and we are here to talk about self-care in 2020 and beyond. We know 2020 has been a very difficult year, and we thought that it would be really great to just get some insight around how we can all do better at trying our best to manage. So Dr. Erica Wise is a consultant, educator, and clinical professor emerita in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at UNC Chapel Hill.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, and I really appreciate the warm and kind introduction.
So 2020 has really been a difficult year for many of us, from the COVID-19 pandemic to there's been a lot of, political issues and, social unrest and, natural disasters. We've really been talking about a lot of this stuff has been going on. And so I guess I'm wondering if you can speak to the ways in which psychologists, especially those in private practice, are being impacted by the many challenges and traumas that are going on right now in 2020?
That's a great question, and you really have beautifully described the intersecting and layered nature of the challenges and traumas that are endemic to the current context. And as psychologists, we are experiencing many of these ourselves as we also strive to provide care and treatment to our clients. And there also are some added stressors specific to our role. I'll mention a few that I've heard from colleagues in a more anecdotal sort of way. I think there are some current surveys that are out there, and I think we'll start to see more publications about this in the near future. So I've heard from a lot of colleagues, and I experienced this myself after some initial positive reaction to being able to kind of, quote, work from home, an option that was not commonly used by most psychologists in private practice prior to the pandemic. Many quickly learned that it was more challenging than expected. Most of us had not set up our homes with the intent of practicing there. Psychologists quickly needed to create confidential spaces and ensure adequate Wi-Fi for remote technologies. This was a particular challenge in dense urban areas where living spaces tend to be smaller, and it was not common for people to happen to have an extra room that they could use as a home office. In addition to the widely reported Zoom fatigue, and I'm using that term generically since of course Zoom is only one of many remote applications, psychologists with children in the home or with partners who were similarly relocating to working at home experienced lots of unexpected stresses and strains. In my work with trainees, which was a big part of my recent practice, many noticed that they really enjoyed the benefits of increased intimacy as they learn more about their clients via glimpses of their homes and their families and their pets. However, this increased intimacy also created some sense of vulnerability, and I think practicing psychologists may experience that as well. Their clients suddenly knew a lot more about them than they typically intended to share. And there also were disruptions and interruptions and threats to confidentiality. I mean, I remember supervising a couples therapy session when young children would come in the room to get snacks from their parents who were trying to practice sharing thoughts and feelings exercises is one example. I also think the ability to have candid conversations with clients who differ from us in terms of race or ethnicity was also a challenge. As a white later career psychologist, I really had not had the opportunity to learn about having those direct conversations. So I think depending on exactly who we are and where we're located in our careers and our own identities, there were sort of new challenges that unfolded. The final thing I'll mention, which I think is a challenge, and I do a lot of consulting and hear about this question a lot, is the telepsychology and jurisdictional practice. I'm hoping these issues will get resolved in the next couple of years at a national level. But currently it is quite complicated. Where I live in North Carolina, there are 3 large universities nearby, and many psychologists in private practice, as well as training clinics, had a lot of their student clients who suddenly left the area when the universities closed in March. And all of a sudden they were grappling with very complicated legal issues about where are supervisors located and clients and therapists. And, again, this was a whole other layer that was essentially unexpected early in the transition to remote treatment.
I totally get that. In private practice, I work a lot with college students. And so when the pandemic happened and a lot of college students went home, trying to figure out and, getting temporary licenses and figuring out whether or not I can continue to treat those individuals during the pandemic, which we all thought in the beginning was just going to be for a brief period of time,
Yes, yeah.
was definitely challenging. So I think all the things you mentioned, a lot of us can really relate to.
Yeah, and I think early on, not only was it where we assumed it would be short term, but there also was a sense of kind of emergencies. There was a bit of a suspension. I mean, some of it was reflected in short term changes in regulation, but also a sense that we were, in an emergency situation. And I think as some of those temporary statutes have lapsed, it's just become much less clear about exactly what the current status is. And there's many websites and links, but it is a sense, it is confusing and complicated for sure.
Absolutely. So before we go into talking about like what psychologists in private practice can do to kind of help themselves take care of themselves during all these challenges that are going on, maybe we can just go into a little bit more about how you define self-care and what actually we mean when we're talking about self-care.
Sure. It's interesting that the awareness of the importance of self-care for psychologists and for other healthcare professionals has really been growing rapidly in recent years. When I first got involved in doing workshops in self-care and then published my first article in 2012, it was really pretty new on the scene. From what I can tell, the term self-care really originated with the 12-step recovery self-help movement. But again, as mentioned, it's been adopted much more broadly by health professionals. And I think it comes from a deep commitment to remaining competent, to realize that part of our competence is not only our technical and academic training, but also our ability to care for ourselves. And a lot of psychologists will sort of look to one of the general principles in our ethics code, which reminds us that our own wellness is really inherent to our ability to serve others. So typically people will cite our physical, emotional, relational, and spiritual selves as in thinking about self-care. And often the focus is on activities and strategies that we use. But I also like some of the deeper definitions. Ellen Baker, who is an early writer on this topic, talked about self-awareness, self-regulation, and balance. Other authors have talked about the enduring quality of our professional functioning over time in the face of really inevitable professional and personal stressors. So I like to think about self-care broadly and recognize that it came from actually a rather spiritual self-help movement, but that I think as psychologists, our technical knowledge can really deepen our understanding of what self-care is and what it can be.
I think one of the things that really stands out to me when you talk about self-care is that it's not just something that makes us feel better, but it really is an ethical imperative as psychologists. And I think sometimes we don't always think about that at first, but that it's really important to consider, just as all the other ways in which continuing our training and our education as psychologists is also ethically important as well.
Yes, I definitely agree that competence is really the ethical enactment of self-care.
So now that we kind of have a sense of what self-care is for psychologists, what recommendations do you have for those in private practice who are really feeling the strain of working right now on top of all the other challenges that today's world is presenting itself? And, part of what I wonder too is in what ways are there maybe differences for psychologists in private practice who are just starting their career compared to those who may be at the mid-career level or more seasoned psychologists as well?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, in some ways that's another layer to how particularly the coronavirus pandemic has impacted practice patterns. So when I've done a lot of workshops on self-care, primarily for state associations, and in one that we did, an early one we did in North Carolina, I was working with a colleague. we decided to ask the participants to have a discussion about stressors and self-care in small groups based on years in practice. And we weren't exactly sure what we would find, but it was fascinating to see that the earlier career psychologists primarily talked about financial stressors and starting families. Those were kind of the common areas. As psychologists move through their professional lifespan, they really focus more on remaining competent and staying connected to friendships and other areas of interest in their lives. And then for psychologists later in their career started to think about making transitions to retirement. But it was interesting for me at the time that I sort of did this workshop. I was probably kind of a later mid-career psychologist, and it was a reminder to me of of how intense those financial stressors were early on. I think what we can add to that in the current context is if you are a early career psychologist and you have young children and you're trying to work from home, that is really, really challenging. One of my nieces is a clinical psychologist in the Philadelphia area, and she has 3 school-age children who are at home while she's trying to do a private practice with a spouse who's also working from home. So, they get up at 4 a.m. to get their work done, and they kind of carefully trade off during the day and try to keep the children out of where they're each working. And, I think it makes whatever the prior challenges were sort of pale in comparison. So, and I think for those of us who, for example, don't have adequate space or don't have children in the home, it can be helpful to remember that our colleagues may be facing challenges that we're just barely aware of.
Yeah, that I think that leads into a really important point is the role of colleagues. And so I guess I wonder a little bit about when it comes to the role of colleagues, especially for those of us who either work independently or for many of us are working from home. And so even if we had previously worked in spaces where we were surrounded by other psychologists, we're not right now. What role can colleagues play in terms of self-care?
Yeah, I think that inherently private practice can be isolating. And earlier in my career, when I was on the APA Ethics Committee and the North Carolina Psychology Board, I noticed anecdotally that many of the psychologists who got into ethical difficulty were isolated. And I think the professional isolation can both sort of lead to just loneliness and potentially more reliance on one's clients as a source of sort of social life and connection, which I think can start to distort the relationship. But also, I think the lack of sort of the feedback that comes and from kind of collaborative discussions around case, peer supervision and case discussion, of course, being mindful of confidentiality in doing so. But I think that isolation can really be quite a risk factor for both personal distress and even potentially for professional difficulties. So I think that if psychologists are going to prioritize aspects outside of their direct work, I would certainly encourage scheduling some regular times, both with social friends and family, but also with colleagues, whether it's through kind of virtual gatherings or safe social distance gatherings, and just to talk about what their days are like or to have ways to process challenging clients. As I'm sure folks know, that some of this is built in particular if you're doing dialectical behavior therapy treatment. The peer and coaching groups provide that as part of the treatment itself. But I think that idea can certainly be extended to other areas and types of practice.
It's interesting because I feel like that's a message that many of us are sharing with our own clients of encouraging them to still stay connected with people, even if it's virtually. And so I think it's important for us to make sure we're doing that for ourselves too.
Yeah, totally. I absolutely agree.
So one of the things I know that you are interested in is the link between self-care and self-compassion. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could, share a little bit more about this for us.
Sure, I would be happy to. And in my own journey through thinking about these kinds of issues for myself and for my colleagues, I was not aware of Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion until fairly recently, and it just really resonated for me very strongly. So I'll kind of share here the three elements that she recommends that I think just fit so nicely with the kind of conceptualization of self-care that we've been talking about. The first element she talks about is self-kindness, which is kindness and understanding towards oneself for experiencing pain or failure versus harsh self-criticism. So really recognizing that we are very human and that we will make mistakes, but that it is a harsh perspective on that that may actually lead us to kind of repeat them rather than being able to learn from them and move on in a positive way. Her second principle is common humanity, that we are part of a larger human experience versus separating and isolating ourselves. And I think for psychologists who live in the intimate world of providing treatment to individuals, recognizing that common humanity can really help us to buffer the limits to what we can do, that we can't cure everybody's distress. We certainly can't cure our own. But I think that recognizing our common humanity can help us be deeply compassionate to others and to ourselves. And her final principle is mindfulness. And in this context, what she means is that we hold our painful thoughts and feelings in a balanced awareness rather than over-identifying with them. So psychologists don't, based on the research I've looked at, are not necessarily more distressed than other professionals, but we're also not less distressed. And so I think this self-compassion practice can really reduce our self-judgment, our isolation, and our rumination. And of course, as we know from our training, that engaging in isolated rumination can also really lead to a downward spiral. So I think that these are really useful principles to remember. Something I tell trainees is that what they're learning in terms of treating clients, in particular, I think CBT and behavioral activation and some of the third wave treatments, acceptance and commitment therapy and dialectic behavior therapy, are all hugely useful to us as individuals and as therapists. So I think that recognizing how powerful these can be and making these part of our not necessarily just what we do, but how we approach ourselves and how we approach our own self-care can be very powerful.
What I really like about that is oftentimes I think the pushback that I hear from psychologists or individuals in general around self-care is, I just don't have the time. Mm-hmm. And, thinking about the connection between self-compassion and self-care, that's something that you don't need to carve out special time for. It's something that you can be working on and reflecting on just in your day-to-day life.
Yeah, I think early on in the first sort of article that I worked on with a couple of former graduate students, we really came up with the idea of, again, because there had been a lot written on what to do for self-care, and we really focused more on the how do we do it. And one of the principles was on integration. So, and I think writing about that for me has served as a reminder. So, in the days when I would still drive to campus, I would be aware of, not every day, but hopefully more days than not, that I would be walking to my car in the parking lot and just take the moment to look up at the sky or to feel the breeze or to look at the trees. I'm fortunate to have worked for many years at UNC Chapel Hill, which is a beautiful campus. But wherever we are, when we are doing other things, driving somewhere, even grocery shopping, we can sort of take a moment to be present and be aware of what's around us. I think in this pandemic context, for me, time outside has been really key, of course, in ways that are safe and social distance, but taking walks, being outside in nature, because I've talked to many colleagues, and I have to work on this myself, overdoing the news or social media or email can really interfere, I think, with our sense of well-being. And there is some research that suggests that from an evolutionary perspective, we really are not prepared for all of the hyper reality contexts we find ourselves in. And of course, when the work also involves remote teletherapy rather than being in spaces with people, I think we may eventually learn that that creates its own added kind of stressors that we might be able to offset by very intentionally being outside.
Yeah. I know for me, it's really made me rethink how I use those 10 or 15 minutes between sessions.
Yeah.
So something even as small as making sure that before the sun goes down, I go outside for those 10 minutes and just get the mail, and have some sort of time outside, even if I can't go for a long walk that day or something, really makes a difference in the time where I'm just staying in my home office for, 5, 6 hours straight or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's, that the hyper reality, as some people have called media, can really interfere with what some authors sort of see as an evolutionary need to have some time in nature. And I know that's challenging. If you live in an urban area, you may have limits to that. But I think even again, just stepping outside and looking at the sky, or stepping outside in the evening and looking at the stars or the moon, I think can connect us with the broader world. And but I think recognizing, taking the time both to do it and then to recognize that it can genuinely make a difference in our sense of well-being is can be really powerful. And maybe noticing that if you step away, you can kind of come back with a renewed sense of creativity. And there is a lot that social psychologists have learned about when we're in a positive mood state, we're better problem solvers and we're more creative. So I think we can sort of intentionally harness that sort of awareness to even small parts of our day, small choice points.
And I think that leads really well into the last question that I have for you today, which is knowing that self-care is really important, not just right now when things are really stressful in the world, but in an ongoing way. I'm curious what advice you have for private practitioners to help them maintain their self-care practices.
Yeah, I've had this discussion with colleagues that if we were talking about, sort of physical exercise or doing yoga or core strength exercises, we would never believe that it's something that we learn and don't have to keep practicing. And so I think the idea that it's not that we're a failure if we have to keep practicing self-care, but that it is much more similar to than it is different from other practices that we have to do on a regular basis. It doesn't mean that we're poor learners or should have mastered it. It's more that this is something that we need to continue to practice. And I think for many aspects of the contemporary world, we're pulled in a lot of directions that maybe are not as good for our self-care. Of course, I'm a strong believer in staying connected to the news and public events, but also to realize we need to get breaks from that, and we need to kind of continually reset our sense of well-being, and I think our sense of connection to the natural world and to other people in our lives. I think that that's something that we need to make a regular practice rather than something that's an add-on or something that we can learn and be done with.
Well, this has been really helpful. I know for me as a new mom and an early career psychologist, this has been both very validating and helpful. And I think many of our members will also find this really helpful. So I really appreciate all the information that you've shared today.
My pleasure.